It's the UFC's money division, the division that seems destined to follow up its most recent golden era with a generation of new fighters that, dare I say it, might be even better. So with an eye on the UFC 280 showdown between the guy who's not technically the champion, but is still quite clearly the defending champion, Charles Oliveira, and the rising challenger, nay the force of nature that is Islam Makhachev, we're going to take a look at the history of the UFC lightweight division and try to give a bit of context about how it ended up getting so goddamn good. Jens Pulver. By the time the inaugural UFC lightweight championship belt was contested, its eventual winner Jens Pulver was already about a year and a half into his promotional run. In that time, he had a record of 3 victories and 1 draw inside the octagon. Notable opponents in Joe Stevenson and Dean Thomas came outside of the UFC, but when Pulver got his hands on UFC gold by defeating Cal Uno on the scorecards, he managed to rack up 2 straight defenses against Dennis Hallman and a very impressive majority decision win against the future champion and legend, BJ Penn. But contract negotiations between Pulver and the UFC broke down, and this champion would leave the promotion for 4 years, without actually losing his title inside the cage. Oddly enough, the belt would also remain without a holder for the next 4.5 years. The organization did put together a tournament to crown a champion, but its final bout between BJ Penn and Cal Uno ended in a draw. This led to the weight class's belt being suspended. Sean Sherk. By the time the muscle shark Sean Sherk made his lightweight debut, he was already a 35-fight veteran, having posted a pretty insane record of 32 wins, 2 losses and a draw. He was fresh off of a unanimous decision at welterweight against a young Nick Diaz, and up until that point his only defeats inside the cage had come against welterweight royalty in Matt Hughes and Georges St-Pierre. At 5'6", he was hardly the tallest welterweight on the roster, even with all of his totally natural, God-given genetic muscular bulk, but dropping down to lightweight made a whole lot of sense. Given his ongoing run of form, Sean Sherk was given a shot at the vacant belt in his divisional debut in 2006, scoring a decision win over the great Kenny Florian in a fight of the night winning effort. He followed that up with a defense of that belt against Hermes Franca, who some of you might know as the guy who submitted a very young Nate Diaz back in the WEC. All seemed to be going Sean Sherk's way. His title reign was in full swing, and his physicality at 155 pounds made him a real handful for his competitors. But then, out of nowhere, in a shock that most of us saw coming, the dude popped for nandrolone in his post-fight drug test. The muscle shark was stripped, making it 2 lightweight champions in a row, the first 2 who had not lost their belt inside the cage. BJ Penn. BJ Penn was already headed for the history books by the time 2008 came around. A 3-time UFC title challenger and a welterweight champion after beating Matt Hughes, Penn had also fought and beaten Rodrigo Gracie at middleweight, Renzo Gracie in a bout that was technically at light heavyweight, while also competing surprisingly well against a puffed-up Lyoto Machida in an open-weight contest. He'd beaten Takanori Gomi, Dean Thomas, Matt Serra, taken Georges St-Pierre to the brink, and after signaling his intentions to carve out a run at 155 pounds, he managed to avenge an earlier defeat to the returning Jens Pulver, who was of course the former champion. Penn looked like a man who was about to carve out some much-needed stability within the division, and over the next year or 2, he did exactly that. This was the prime version of the prodigy, and the way he scored consecutive finishes of Pulver, Joe Stevenson, and Sean Sherk really showed him to be one of the most well-rounded fighters in the game. A move back up to 170 mid-title reign, of course, ended with a 4th-round corner stoppage defeat to Georges St-Pierre in their second fight, and let's face it, it was a pretty underwhelming showing from Penn, something that would become a trend. But at this point in time, his lightweight flame had not yet been extinguished, and after moving back down, he managed to score another pair of defenses against formidable opposition in Kenny Florian and Diego Sanchez, showcasing some of his very best work in the cage. This guy was hitting a stride that was warranting some very well-deserved pound-for-pound discussion, but the MMA gods had decreed that this man would be knocked off his pedestal through the most unlikely of challengers, Frankie Edgar. Frankie Edgar is a natural bantamweight, not even a big bantamweight by most metrics, who spent most of his career fighting at featherweight, but achieved his biggest successes at lightweight. And after going 12-1 in his first 13 as a pro, losing only to Gray Maynard, Edgar was set up for a showdown with BJ Penn that wasn't really seen as overly competitive on paper. Sure, the general public and the analysts of the sport gave Edgar kudos for his work rate, his wrestling, his clean boxing technique, but BJ Penn was the man at this point in time, a force that may not have had an equal on his best night, and the betting odds really did bury Frankie's chances of winning. So when he went in there and gave Penn a pretty damn close fight, earning the judge's decision, the general public were finally convinced of Frankie's elite status, but not everyone was convinced that he actually won the fight. Most media outlets scored it pretty comfortably for BJ, and because of this, days, a rematch was set for UFC 118, with an overwhelming majority of predictions backing the former champion to restore order at the top of the division with a huge win. But Frankie went out there and dominated Penn, winning every round on the scorecards to earn his first defense of the belt, and he would follow this up with a pair of performances against his old rival Gray Maynard that would instantly mark his name among the very greatest and most dogged warriors of his generation. That second fight of their trilogy in particular, which ended in a draw, it was an inhuman display of toughness and resilience. Frankie was 2 defenses into his time as champion, but he would never again score a win in the division where he had first become champion. Benson Henderson. Smooth Benson Henderson was a guy who really did live up to his name. Supremely well-rounded and intelligent inside the cage, Henderson had already notched up a hugely impressive resume by the time he had landed in the UFC, sharing the cage with future legends like Donald Cerrone and Anthony Pettis before the WEC was eventually dissolved. And when that organization was shelved, there was a huge influx of talent into the lower weight classes that really filled out the promotion with a level of balance that it never had before. And it's funny because while the records do show a 2-0 scoreline in favor of Bendo versus the champion Edgar, between their initial fight and especially in the rematch, you could really argue that Frankie won both. But Henderson was a deserving leader for the lightweight division, and he proved as much by then dominating Nate Diaz before going to a pretty close decision against Gilbert Melendez. But in 2013, at UFC 164, he was about to once again come face to face with perhaps his most formidable rival, Anthony Pettis. Anthony Pettis was on the cusp of being a major superstar. Even during his run in the WEC, who can forget that legendary Showtime kick he pulled off in the final round of his first bout against Benson Henderson, their shared final fight in the promotion before joining the UFC. That was a star-making performance and a huge signifier of what was about to follow, except the UFC debut of Pettis' dreams was ruined by a particularly workmanlike performance from fan favorite Clay Guida, where he used his pressure and wrestling to stifle Showtime from the get-go. But Anthony Pettis did prove his mettle by rebounding in hugely impressive form, going 3-0 with nasty finishes of Donald Cerrone and Joe Lozon to earn his first title shot. His old WEC rival Benson Henderson was right there waiting for his revenge, but this time, Pettis would not take 5 rounds to unleash his standout moment. After landing a series of very hard body kicks, Showtime, for whatever reason, fired off an acrobatic kick that left him off balance and vulnerable to Benson's takedown. But Pettis has never been a slouch off his back, and in showing this, he managed to latch onto an armbar, one that forced a tap in the later stages of the opening round. He would go on to extend his run as champion with a victory over Gilbert Melendez, tapping the former Strikeforce king in the second round. But the success that Clay Guida was able to have against Pettis in his promotional debut would lead to a blueprint, an approach that would stifle this dynamic offensive threat. And the guy who would really crack the code when it came to Anthony Pettis at the time did look set to be on a collision course with greatness. Rafael Dos Anjos. Sometimes a fighter rises out of the ups and downs of potential obscurity. We've seen it recently to a far more extreme extent with Glover Teixeira, but for a while, Rafael Dos Anjos was in a slightly similar situation. It's not that he was ever counted out, but he did enter the UFC with a huge knockout loss to Jeremy Stevens, before then going 4 wins, 4 losses in his first 8. And though you could see it in shades, that guy didn't really showcase the early signs of the absolute monster version of Rafael Dos Anjos that would eventually rise up. An 8-1 run would follow, and this RDA looked to be a different beast entirely. His sole loss during this period came against the great Khabib Nurmagomedov, but once the Eagle fell out of the sport due to injuries for about 2 years, Dos Anjos beat Benson Henderson and Nate Diaz in quick succession to earn his shot at the belt. And the fight with Pettis? Well, to this day, it's still one of my favorite title-winning performances. There was just something so complete about the way he picked Pettis apart, especially when you consider who he was beating, the pace, the pressure, the way he nullified Pettis' game down to a T. He managed to take home the belt that night by thoroughly stifling one of the best strikers in the game. It was a dominant performance from a champion who was really showing himself to be one of the most well-rounded fighters in the sport. His follow-up victory over Donald Cerrone in just 66 seconds only served to further his reputation, and I remember at this time people were starting to wonder just how close Dos Anjos was to being seriously mentioned within the 155-pound GOAT conversation. But oftentimes it's just around this point where the wheels start to fall off, and for Dos Anjos, that push towards greatness came to an end under pretty shocking circumstances. Eddie Alvarez. Eddie Alvarez did seem to be in a bit of a transformative period during his early UFC run. Those who had watched him during the 4 or so not-so golden years he spent in Bellator, probably thought they knew what to expect from Alvarez when he signed with the UFC. Those instant classic battles with Michael Chandler in particular stood as a testament to just how gritty and vicious a competitor the Underground King was. But after losing his UFC debut to Donald Cerrone, Alvarez kind of bottled up his rage, going back-to-back with split decision victories over Gilbert Melendez and Anthony Pettis that, if memory serves, showcased a much more patient, relaxed, and mature version of Eddie. That Melendez fight was definitely more fun than the Pettis one, but by the time Alvarez had reached his 4th UFC fight, he was 2-1 in the promotion, but he did have back-to-back victories against some real top-level contenders. So the fight with Rafael Dos Anjos was set up, and on paper it was the overbearing pressure and physical dominance of RDA against this evolving version of the veteran Alvarez, who still possessed the means to turn up his aggression a notch if needed. But when fight night came around, the result we got was actually quite shocking. I know personally at that time I had some pretty big notions about where RDA was headed in terms of the GOAT conversation within the division, but Eddie tagged him very early on, beginning a wild finishing sequence that eventually saw him crowned champion. It was a huge moment for this guy's legacy, but unfortunately it would not last long. Conor McGregor. You don't need me to break down Conor McGregor's backstory too much at this stage, but for a quick overview, he had pretty much run through the featherweight division, capturing 145-pound gold with a stunning 13-second KO of the legendary longtime champion Jose Aldo. From there, after going 1-1 in a pair of instant classic bouts against Nate Diaz, Conor then opted to chase after the lightweight title, the title he was originally scheduled to compete for at UFC 196, when Rafael Dos Anjos was champion. In his place, following his first-round TKO, was Eddie Alvarez. Now, the fight with Alvarez was not competitive at all. In fact, I would go as far as to say that this victory was among the most perfect performances we've seen from a challenger in a UFC title fight. It was as though the featherweight version of Conor McGregor had only existed so he could win his first belt before showing us his real prime at 155 pounds. Except that's not how it played out at all. 2 long years and a hell of a lot of trouble would go by before McGregor made his next walk to the octagon, looking like a diminished version of himself in every sense of the word. Naturally, the UFC, after doing everything they could to try and extend his title reign, were forced to strip him of his belt, but in his absence a new threat was looming. And though at this point in time we were still calling BJ Penn the 155-pound GOAT, doubts were starting to creep in with each passing appearance from this next UFC lightweight champion, Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib Nurmagomedov debuted in the UFC in 2012, going a clean and for the most part dominant 5-0 before coming up against the yet-to-be-crowned champion Rafael Dos Anjos. Nurmagomedov well and truly beat the brakes off RDA over the course of the scheduled 3 rounds, showing his superiority through his pressure and constant work rate against a guy who would eventually use similar traits to become a real pound-for-pound contender, albeit for a short time. But Khabib's hype levels took a hit around this time when he was forced into a 2-year absence from the sport due to constant injuries that kept him from acting on his clear potential. When he finally worked his way back to fitness, and through that, a shot at UFC gold, the infamous UFC 223 fight week left him without Tony Ferguson as an opponent, without the name value of the featherweight champion Max Holloway who tried to step in, and of course the whole bus dolly situation with the angry mob. But anyway, Ali Aquinta was the man who got the call, and though it wasn't a championship level opponent, it was still a very impressive performance, and Khabib's opportunity to mark his name down in the history books would come shortly after. A dominant effort against the returning Conor McGregor left very little doubt as to the identity of the best 155-pound fighter on the planet, with his star power going through the roof. He then scored back-to-back submission wins over Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje to really stamp down his pound-for-pound #1 claim, and just like that, he was gone. Khabib left the sport at the height of his powers, ending his unbeaten 29-fight run in MMA just before he reached that clean 30-fight milestone. But as the belt became vacant, yet another powerhouse was about to rise up and put together a run of form that really did start to send people into discussion once again: Charles Oliveira. And that brings us to our most recent champion, to the ongoing reign of the guy who is technically not the champion anymore, but let's face it, there is a champion and his name is Charles Oliveira. Anyway, his story was one of such unlikely success that few believed that it was even a possibility, despite his clear run of form. Finish after finish, we watched as Charles started to shed all of the labels that had been following him through the first decade or so of his career. The guy was refined, he was technical, he didn't quit on himself at all, and despite all of this, he was retaining all of the chaos that made him who he was. And after climbing into a vacant title fight against Michael Chandler, Oliveira went on a frankly ridiculous 3-fight streak of finishes, delighting crowds with wild showdowns against Chandler, Dustin Poirier, and Justin Gaethje. You all know the rest of the story. Islam Makhachev is up next, the heir to Khabib Nurmagomedov's throne, and the fighter who looks best suited to handling Oliveira's unparalleled finishing ability. Will he get the job done? Who knows? But be sure to let us know in the comments section below how you see the UFC 280 lightweight title clash playing out. Also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thank you for watching.